To cross the strait, she had to pawn a large portion of her jewelry, both the brooches inherited from her mother and several gold rings gifted by the King of Scotland. Margaret Drummond kept only her most cherished possessions, but she had little doubt that she would sell them on the continent as well. The Queen was left with not a penny to her name. Margaret Drummond, born in the 14th century, hailed from a proud and Highland clan. Her father had governed the territory west of Stirling for 10 generations, which earned the Drummonds considerable respect in Scotland. They, in turn, maintained the right to decide whom to support. Margaret's ancestors had sworn allegiance to the kings of England at times and waged war against them at others. A truly unpredictable family. A girl from a mountain clan had to be skilled in many areas, not only reading, sewing, and horseback riding, but also managing an estate if her husband decided to spend long periods at war, handling finances, and, if necessary, shooting a bow. The Drummonds could take pride in their Margaret. She was a perfect match for her station. Sir Malcolm believed that his daughter's husband should be just as rebellious as he was, so without hesitation, he blessed the union of Margaret with Sir John Logie, who was much older than her. Sir John had once been involved in a conspiracy against King Robert Stuart, which resulted in him losing his hereditary lands. But King David Bruce restored all his possessions. By the time of their wedding, Logie was able to provide for his wife. Unlike his wife's relatives, Sir John preferred to stay close to the king and his court. Thus, Margaret soon found herself in the royal residence of King David II Bruce, in the ancient town of Scone. Beautiful and spirited, Margaret Drummond stood in stark contrast to the ailing Scottish queen, which naturally captivated the king. He already had an official mistress, Lady Catherine Mortimer, but she was quickly replaced. Although the affair between David Bruce and Sir John's wife was kept under wraps, no one in Scone doubted that they were lovers. Then, the Queen of Scotland, Joanna, died of the plague. Not particularly beautiful, unloved, and childless, she could not compel David to mourn for long. The king needed an heir, and so he began to seek a new bride. Circumstances took a turn when, less than a year later, Margaret's husband, Sir John Logie, passed away. Little is known about the cause, but it is likely that he too succumbed to the plague that had swept through Scotland. It was then that the king pondered. Should he marry Margaret Drummond? She belonged to an ancient, noble, and respected family, and such a choice would surely be welcomed in Scotland. Why would he need another Englishwoman? Of course, Margaret enthusiastically accepted David Bruce's proposal. They married, and the new queen's family received a plethora of favors. Her brother acquired several estates, her uncle became an earl, and her niece Annabella was betrothed to a member of the Stuart family. But the newly elevated Drummonds made a remarkably foolish mistake. Margaret's relatives turned into overly arrogant and haughty upstarts. Wherever they could, they flaunted their power and influence, provoking increasing resentment. Initially pleased that the king had married a local woman, the Scots soon began to grumble, particularly the two prominent clans, Campbell and Stuart. Intrigues began to brew. Margaret, meanwhile, struggled with her primary duty, bearing a son. She prayed in temples, consulted healers, and tried every remedy known to the physicians, but nothing worked. Anxious and frustrated, the Queen of Scotland often lashed out, and her husband's reproaches led to arguments. 2 years after their wedding, David Bruce took a new mistress. This time, he was brazen about it. Agnes Dunbar appeared everywhere with the king. Ultimately, David Bruce divorced Margaret Drummond, declaring her barren. Enemies mocked the Drummond clan, from princes back to the dirt, but Margaret decided to fight for her status. Drying her tears, she set off to see the Pope in Avignon, which had become the new Rome during those years. To make the journey, Margaret had to sell her jewelry. Her family either couldn't or wouldn't help her financially. Surprisingly, she managed to secure an audience with Urban V quickly. The Avignon Pope, after hearing the story of the dismissed queen, expressed his support for Margaret. This meant he would not recognize her divorce from David Bruce. The pontiff issued a bull declaring Margaret the legitimate Queen of Scotland and threatened David Bruce with excommunication if he insisted on the annulment. Emboldened, Margaret wrote to her family, but the reply was terse. They knew about the situation in Scotland, but King David had no intentions of restoring her rights. He was living with Agnes, and if Margaret had an army at her disposal, she could certainly try to fight her way back to the royal chambers. But Margaret had no army, and she was nearly out of money. De jure, she was the Queen of Scotland, but in reality, she could prove nothing to anyone. Even returning home was problematic. Soon, however, such a necessity vanished. King David Bruce suddenly passed away. From then on, Margaret would be referred to as the former queen regardless. She spent another 4 years in France, supported by the funds that the pontiff generously lent her. When she passed away, even her burial expenses were covered by the Pope. The Queen of Scotland had not a penny to her name. Yet a member of the Drummond lineage eventually took the throne. Her niece Annabella was crowned as the new Queen of Scotland at the end of the 14th century,